Hey everyone, crazy story. So I just randomly found an unopened set of IEMs called the BQEYZ Wind lying in the snow outside. Lo and behold, it's now in my possession, ready to be unboxed. Let's begin. Now the design of this IEM is just incredible, truly breathtaking, from the uniquely shaped vents to the sharp lettering to the gorgeous blue metal colorway. It just looks so damn clean in every way. Definitely a breath of fresh air from the typical resin shell designs that you often see, in my opinion. Speaking of fresh air, that's kind of how this IEM sounds like. Like its name and color, the sound, I would say it's quite cool and airy. Um, not cold, just somewhat cool on a cool breeze on a spring day. What I'm really getting at here is that you're not really getting a rich or like a super savory sound signature. If you're expecting to get, absolutely blanketed by a thick layer of cozy mids for the winter, this is not the IEM to go for. Instead, the sound in its entirety is more on the leaner side of things, but while still staying far away from sounding thin and analytical. Let's first start with the bass. My first impressions is that despite the bone conduction driver, this set is definitely not for bass heads. I find the bass is pretty selective, showing its full power during some passages while being restrained in other passages. But when its full power is shown, it can get quite powerful. In terms of characteristics, it's pretty quick and nimble with an emphasis more on sub than mid bass. and it has a sufficient amount of texture and resolution. So if you like your bass more in the background and only appears when needed, then you'll really like this set. Now the mids on this set are generally quite good, but as I said before, it's not exactly like a thick, lush, and full-bodied mids that envelope you like a cozy blanket, so you might be a bit disappointed with the quantity. Those were certainly my first impressions. After forming a more matured opinion, I have to say these are some very well-tuned and euphonic sounding mids. Instruments of all kind have a very pleasant timbre, and it brings a certain polish and finesse to the sound that I cannot put into words. Even more impressive is how well it resolves details and nuances in your music. This might not be apparent on the first few listens, but just give it more time and you will come across tracks in which the wind becomes quite a resolving set. As a whole, the mid-range is quite lean and transparent, and its presence is just slightly more laid back than upfront. But it is never thin sounding. It feels like the wind's mid-range was tuned with a neutral reference monitor sort of sound in mind, while clearly also focusing on musicality, the best of both worlds. I find that the mids fare best with certain tracks that sound inherently warm and veiled to begin with, such as Beneath the Mask from the Persona 5 OST. On the other hand, it may not be great for genres that require a certain coloration in the mid-frequency, such as pop music. To summarize, the mids have a beautiful and remarkably clean and polished tuning, but it just lacks that truly rich or engaging quality that you might be looking for. Many hi-fi brands often like to exaggerate the pinna gain area to a detrimental degree, and I'm glad to say that the BQEYZ win is not one of them, at least most of the time. It does have a peak around 2.5 kHz, which misbehaves sometimes and could get a bit intrusive, but I find it to be controlled in most cases. The highs on the win are commendable. Honestly, I have to give props to BQEYZ for turning out a set that focuses on transparency in the treble region. This is my preferred kind of tuning, where the treble is bright, yet not fatiguing. The frequency response utilizes several narrow and fine treble peaks at a nosedive trajectory to resolve transients, but rarely does this ever introduce sibilance. This makes cymbals on the wind sound airy and realistic, and it gives strings and flute instruments its proper attack and raspiness, respectively. However, if I had to nitpick, I do have to say that the upper treble peak is just a bit more piercing than I would like, though wearing foam tips greatly helps. And if I had to nitpick even more, I would say it's not the most detailed treble I've heard. Now onto the technicalities. To be honest, I was a bit underwhelmed in this area at first. The soundstage is by no means small, but it doesn't really seem quite spacious in terms of width. Depth and height are quite adequate though. Perhaps my complaint is rather in its unimpressive imaging capability. There's little of that, convincing, vivid, immersive, 3D pinpoint positioning to be found here. In my opinion, the weakest area of the win is its instrument separation. It just does not fare well in very complex passages and fails to give each instrument its proper spotlight. This is especially true in busy EDM tracks. Let's talk about the BQEYZ Spring 2, because that was the last recent IEM I had from them, so naturally this comparison makes sense. I would consider the win as a direct upgrade from the Spring 2. It's better in all regards, mostly in the treble. While the Spring 2 was a hot mess up there with barely any resolution, the Wind's treble serves as a compelling counter-argument with much better extension, tuning, resolution, and sibilance control. The Spring 2 also had a pretty cramped soundstage, and the Wind is much better in this regard as well. The only area where the Spring 2 could hold its own ground is in its mids, which is tonally more rich sounding, but that's about it. Now let's talk about the Triple Win X HBB Alina. Now this was an interesting and honestly very fitting comparison. The reason being because these two IEMs have an uncannily similar sound and it also grabs identically. So how do they compare? Well, I can say that for certain that the highs on the Alina are a bit more resolving on the details, and they have a slightly more realistic sounding timbre. The Alina is also the one with a boomier and more upfront bass, but other than that, the Wind still has its upper ground with regards to the mids. Honestly though, you can find an aftermarket Alina selling for around $50, so that alone makes the Alina quite impressive for its price. There is one last thing I want to touch upon, and that is its drivability. I found that the Wind is rather hard to drive on a smartphone, and even when plugged into a moderately powerful desktop amp, it still falls behind in volume compared to most sets. Overall, the BQEYZ Wind is a great set in its own right, but it's not a straightforward rec. It's definitely not for everyone, but if you want a relatively neutral yet musical set that prioritizes transparency over denseness, or if you want a set that is great for both audio monitoring and music listening, then I can definitely see this being suitable for you. Just be sure to grab one near $200 or lower, because in this price segment and beyond, diminishing returns will start to kick in. And that about wraps it up for this video, which by the way was not sponsored, but I hope BQEYZ and I can work something out in the future. I hope you all enjoyed this review. Thanks for watching.